It's the 24th of December, 1914, Christmas Eve, and one of the most enduring and heavily mythologized moments in military history is about to play out, the Christmas Truce. Between Christmas Eve and Boxing Day, a series of unofficial ceasefires took place along a section of the Western Front, as British and German soldiers crossed into no man's land to exchange gifts, sing carols, have a kickabout, and take a quiet pause from the brutal and bloody fighting. The First World War was supposed to be over by Christmas, and for a fleeting moment, it was. I'm James Hanson. Merry Christmas, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today we're back talking about the First World War, a conflict that many in 1914 believed would be wrapped up by December. Yet by the time of the Christmas Truce, it was clear the Great War would drag on for years to come. But what if it had ended that day and really was over by Christmas? That's a question for our experts, and joining me as ever is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And once again on the channel is Professor Alexander Watson, Professor of History at Goldsmiths University. Okay, so Christmas 1914. Let's talk about the wider context of what is happening in the war at this point. Chris Parry, to start with you, as I mentioned, there's this kind of famous, sense that it would all be done by Christmas 1914, but trench warfare has very much come into force. So what is the lay of the land at this point?
So both sides have settled down at this point into what we now see as the familiar trench warfare. There's a line running from the Channel coast here all the way to Switzerland. 2/3 of it is manned on the Allied side by the French, the top third by the Belgians, and also by the British. Facing them, of course, you've got Germany, Austro-Hungary, Turkey about to make a contribution against essentially Russia, Great Britain, France, and soon Italy as well. But there's stalemate essentially on the Western Front. What has happened is the Germans have tried to implement their Schlieffen Plan, which was designed to knock out Paris and France inside of 40 days.
Almost a kind of World War I equivalent of Blitzkrieg, could you call it that?
No, I think it's really a rerun of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, but with more advanced technologies, machine guns and things like that. And so what they've done is they've instituted a very large hook attack that was designed to go south of Paris to actually cut off. It's very much like the sickle cut in World War II that we saw. But in fact, what the Germans realise is because of the deployment of the British Expeditionary Force and very substantial deployments by the French south and east of Paris, they don't actually have the manpower to do that. So Moltke, who is the von Moltke, who is the German commander, actually says, you know what, we'll send the First and Second Armies north of Paris. And the generals there are very aggressive, not very happy about that. But they do that. And what happens is the British and the French and some of the Belgians retreat 160 kilometers back. They then turn about and re-attack the Germans on what is known as the Battle of the Marne. And that basically pushes the Germans back. And at this point, von Moltke, the commander-in-chief of the German army, says that we've blown it. At this point, there's no point in going on. The Kaiser and the General Staff say Moltke's lost it, and he's replaced by von Falkenhayn. And the situation we find ourselves in 1914, after this happens, is this race to the sea that we know happened, where everybody's trying to overlap and outflank each other, leading to the Channel coast. And as I said, by December 1914, we're settled down in this stalemate, very much like the one in Ukraine today.
And Alex, to bring you in, just before we get to how the truces came about, what was why did people think it would be over by 1914 originally? What was the rationale there? Because, people weren't expecting this to be trench warfare at the outset of the Great War.
So not everyone did. I think that's the first thing to say. I mean, the Kaiser, when his troops go off, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was notoriously for getting things wrong, told his troops that you will be back before the leaves fall from the trees, kind of very romantic image of autumn. And of course, it didn't happen. The British, who are much less prepared than the French or the Germans or the Russians or indeed anybody else, by contrast, are gearing up for a much, much longer war. Kitchener is raising his new armies, and men sign up either for 3 years or the duration. And you've got men coming in from August volunteering for the services. Even in December 1914, more than 100,000 volunteer for service. So it's a mix. At the front, there are soldiers who do think the war will end in Christmas. But I think that's more about just hope rather than any rationale. It's a way of getting through. It's a coping mechanism, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's also a recruiting tool. You know, if you think it's going to be over by Christmas, I mean, my great uncle was in Welsh Guards, and he specifically said to his family when he went off to join his regiment, he actually said, "Look, I'll see you at Christmas. I've been told it'll be over by Christmas."
They can flip it as well, though, because some of the more senior figures in the British Army and the government claim that the problem why recruiting is going down in December a bit is because people are saying it'll be over by Christmas, so they're using that as an excuse not to come in. People are amazing at using the same idea to argue different things, and that.
I mean, to be fair, I mean, I think a lot of people were saying, Look at the Franco-Prussian War. It was over. Essentially, the fighting was over in 4 months.
Yeah.
There was a lot of mopping up after that by the Germans and getting themselves established as a country. I think had the Germans won, had they actually got south of Paris, it would have been over.
It would have been over by Christmas.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
You know, they'd have won on away goals in football terms.
And
probably could have actually said, right, okay, we've done what we wanted to do. We knocked out the French. We're now going to turn east to deal with the Russians, who are still on the warpath. Who wants to come to peace terms?
Well, we will come back in due course to what it would have taken for the war to be over by Christmas. Chris, when did it become clear that it wouldn't be?
Well, as Alex says, I think quite a lot of people thought this is industrial-scale warfare. We've got to mobilise our society and also our armed forces for the long haul. I think we've also got to remember there have been quite a few issues at sea as well. So we've had 3 cruisers torpedoed off the Belgian coast. We've had the Battle of the Falkland Islands and Coronel. And also we've had the Battle of the Heligoland Bight. So there have been quite a few losses taken. And at this point, everybody still thinks they can win.
Don't forget the British blockade either.
Absolutely.
The whole of the North Sea has been closed off to maritime traffic by the British too. They're in this for the long haul, I think.
But if you're, whichever country you are right now, you think you're in with a chance of winning if you actually mobilise bigger and faster than your opponent. And nobody here, once we get to this stage, is saying we're going to achieve any of the reasons for which we entered this war.
On the topic of the naval blockade, we did do an episode recently on the Battle of Jutland, so if you missed that, go back and check it out. Alex, let's talk about the Christmas truces, because they have gone down in legend. How did they come about? Was it an official thing? Was it more of an ad hoc thing done by the men on the front lines, or was it a combination?
So it was ad hoc, that's the first thing. Second thing is, as Chris has said, you have this tremendous activity, fighting activity, and significant bloodshed in the summer and autumn of 1914. There's a lot of very heavy fighting just in this corner of Belgium. And by December, the Germans have taken heavy casualties. The British, Belgian, French, and indeed Indian troops as well have taken heavy casualties. The ground is very waterlogged. December has the biggest rainfall of any December since 1876. So it's really, really wet. And regardless of whether you're German, you're British, you're Indian, you're feeling pretty miserable by this point.
Yeah.
There's bodies in no man's land as well. So this really begins in part through exhaustion and through a desire just to have a bit of a pause. So you get what are called live and let live truces, which were quite common through 1914 to 1918 on the Western Front, in quarter sectors, where men just wouldn't provoke the other side. And that's the beginnings of this, just not provoking the other side, just for a moment of peace. And that starts through early December onwards.
And Chris, I suppose what Alex is describing there is what most people think of when you think of trench warfare. You know, the conditions in December 1914 would have been the worst possible conditions. Muddy, wet, cold. bad sanitation, and troops with very low morale.
Yeah, and what adds to the atmosphere is the fact there's a very heavy frost on Christmas Eve. So all the water is frozen over, and so is the ground. So it looks, fairly sort of Christmas-like. And quite a lot of the stories say that the Germans started singing Silent Night, Stille Nacht. They had candles and lights in their trenches, and they started testing each other to see whether they were going to shoot. And what happened in the end is you had a series of exchanges, fraternizations along the British front. Significantly, the French didn't go in for this. And certainly the Bavarian regiments opposing the British and the French wouldn't play ball at all. In fact, Hitler said afterwards, that's not what soldiers do in wartime. It dishonors us to do that sort of thing. We should be fighting every day. So very mixed. And I think we should stress it only happened in a very small 100-mile sector of the British end of the front. And in other areas, it just continued. The Germans proposed a sort of a truce, but in fact, one of our regiments, I think it was the Welsh regiment, said, we're not having any of this. At my command, rapid fire now.
Well,
they actually shot back.
It's a really interesting point you raised, Chris, about the fact that this was not happening across the entirety of the Western Front, just a section of it. So on that note, let's zoom in on that section of the Western Front where these truces took place. OK, let's talk in detail now about the section of the Western Front where the Christmas Truce took place. And Alex, as you were saying, it was really only kind of the northernmost section of the Western Front, of the line itself, really in northern France and southern Belgium, Flanders, essentially the section where the British were. And that's an interesting point. Why was it really just the British on the Allied side who observed the Christmas Truce?
So that is interesting, and especially since so many of the sources say that it's actually the Germans who initiate it. It's the Germans who put the Christmas trees up on their parapets with candles, and they're doing that along the front. But the French aren't very responsive, in part, of course, because the Germans have invaded their country, which is bound to sour any Christmas celebration. But I think it's more than that. I think it's also because there are so many shared traditions between the Germans and the British. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, back in the 19th century, brought over all sorts of Christmas celebrations. Christmas trees have been around in England since the early 19th century, thanks to the German royal family. And then, of course, you've got Silent Night, which is originally a German carol and which, as Chris has said, is sometimes the starting point for these moments of I guess, coming together, for want of a better phrase.
And so as the sound of, well, they would say Stille Nacht, but as the sound of that carol kind of drifts over no man's land, that the British recognise it in the way the French maybe wouldn't.
There's this cultural connection, absolutely, which in this part of the front, this northern sector, brings soldiers together. Yeah.
And Chris, there are so many... Well, I don't know, we'll explore. Are they myths of things that happened during the Christmas Truce? The football games, for instance. Did they really take place?
There's no doubt that kick-arounds happened, whether it was between British soldiers themselves or between the British and the Germans. That certainly took place. What didn't happen was a formal football match where people put their caps down as goals and they played. And as the legend has it, the Germans won 3-2, didn't have to go to penalties. That, I think, is a myth. The idea of a formal Britain against Germany football match, it doesn't have much credibility or provenance, but certainly we have photographic evidence of kick-arounds in no man's land. There are also a large number of stage pictures that don't take place during this truce to say it did happen. Significantly, as far as I know, they don't appear in newsreel footage. There's a very... we're in the early stages now of sort of film footage from the front. There's no evidence on video of any of that happening. And as I said, there's no photographic evidence of a formal football game.
Sorry, Alex.
I'm going to come in there, just to create a bit of controversy, because I'm not sure. I think the whole idea of the Germans beating the British 3-2 is entirely plausible.
Well, it's normal.
It's normal, that's right, yeah. And there is so this idea comes actually from an account of a German officer, a guy called Niemöller, who was in the 133rd Saxon Regiment. And they were, there has been some really interesting research on this, and they were up against the Argylls in the Lys Valley, just in the north, just where we've been talking about. They went into the front on the 24th of December, on Christmas Eve for them, which for Germans, it's important to say, is the day of celebration.
Yes.
You know, for the British, it's the 25th, but for the Germans, it's the 24th. And that's why these Christmas truces start on the 24th, because it's the Germans who are initiating it, it's Germans who want peace, it's the Germans who are looking to celebrate. And Niemöller, in an interview in the 60s, he does say that we were up against these Scottish troops, but on the 24th, we did start singing, we heard their bagpipes as well, and we did send an officer over, they sent an officer over, we talked, and the following day, he says, we did come out of our trenches, and we did play football. Not, as you say, Chris, some sort of massively organised international game. They planned that for the 26th. It never took place, but they planned it for the 26th.
Ah.
But he did say, and we beat them 3-2.
I mean, you've got. I mean, as a historian, Alex, you've got to see there's a heavy retrospective there.
Yeah.
But still.
And also, the interview took place at about the time that England won the World Cup against Germany in 1966.
That's fair.
Yeah.
It is worth saying, though, as well, just for viewers, that when you imagine the Western Front as sort of this pitted, cratered, ruined place. A lot of those images come from 1916, 1917, the material battle period. In 1914, the shellfire was much less. And in fact, at this time, neither side can really do very much because it's a time of munitions shortage. They've expended a lot of their shells in the October and November battles. So it is plausible that there were some fairly flat fields. This particular unit, the Saxon Regiment, was opposite the Argylls over a cabbage patch, over a cabbage field, and it was frosty, as Chris has said. So it's plausible. The landscape wasn't pitted. It didn't have all those shells. So you could have found a space in this area for a football pitch.
Now, we're going to go a bit Antiques Roadshow for a moment now. The eagle-eyed among you will have spotted that, Alex, you have a beautiful tin, which you're holding up now. Can you just explain what that is exactly?
So this is a gift tin from the Princess Mary Gift Fund, which was set up in October. Now, Princess Mary was George V's 17-year-old daughter. And she had this idea of giving every single British soldier and sailor a Christmas gift out of her personal allowance. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors, so this was pointed out to her that even though she was a princess, probably she didn't quite have the funds to do that. So she gave her name to this fund, which collected contributions from around the country to give every soldier and sailor a gift, and 355,000 of these were distributed just before Christmas 1914 to the soldiers. And most of them had tobacco in them, tobacco and cigarettes. Obviously damaging to health, but if you're in the Western Front in 1914,
pretty
probably
damaging to your health.
Yeah, exactly. Least of your troubles. But for non-smokers, they had ones with writing paper in. There were Indian troops who got sweets, mix of things. They ran out of these things as well. So sometimes they put pencils and other stuff in them. But yeah, every single British soldier on the Western Front got one of these, and you can see her likeness on the front, and then Britain, the British Empire, and her allies are engraved around the side. And it was a useful little tin. It was airtight, so lots of soldiers kept them and used them to store. It was waterproof.
I mean, it's a genuinely beautiful tin. Thank you so much for bringing it in. Chris, you can be our antiques expert here. How much you give Alex for that?
Well, Alex, I've got to ask you first, how did you come about it?
I got it in an auto jumble or a car boot sale back in the 1990s. All of this stuff was very frequent. I used to collect this stuff.
How much did you pay for it?
Oh, it was probably £3, £4, £5 at that time.
OK, I think on a good day in auction today, I think you probably get £300 or £400 for that.
There you go. Well, I'll retire early, huh?
One of the things I want to ask you, Alex, is this idea of exchanging gifts between the Germans and the British in no man's land. They wander over and they exchange gifts. Did that happen? And what kind of gifts would they actually be giving each other if it did? Yeah,
so it definitely did happen. If you go to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum, you can see a picture of the 133rd Saxon Regiment's pre-war football team, which someone gave them. But you've got cap badges, chocolate. There's a Bavarian unit that rolled over, apparently, at least in myth, legend, but it might be true, a couple of barrels of beer and got plum puddings in return. Food, though, food especially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Chris, do we know how this would have been received back home? I mean, did people back home know that these Christmas truces were taking place? And presumably there must have been some people on the Western Front who were sensitive to how this may be perceived.
Took a while for the news to get out. I mean, some of these truces extended to the new year as well. But we don't see any evidence in newspapers till about 2 months later that these might have happened. Commanders generally along the front don't want this to happen, and disciplinary action is being taken. And I think I should point out that the interaction between the Coldstream and Grenadier Guards and the Germans is distinctly hostile.
Yeah.
There's a infamous event where Sergeant Collins of the Monmouthshire Regiment is encouraged to go across and talk to the Germans, who promptly try to take him prisoner. And when he escapes, they shoot him. So
wow.
then it's over. So this is by no means a universal sort of feeling of goodwill along the front.
And this is only, as we've discussed, in a relatively small section of the front. Elsewhere, the fighting presumably was continuing over Christmas?
No, I think as Alex says, it wasn't so much Christmas, it was the state of the ground, and also the fact that actually ammunition was very low. If you look at the artillery returns at this time, they're not firing much artillery, except at specific targets that they can see. What is going on is a lot of mining underneath the trenches all the way through this period, because it's pretty hard on top. You've got quite a lot of mining going underneath each other's lines.
And Alex, was it really only something that happened in 1914, or did we see Christmas truces later on in the war?
So you see some attempts in 1915, and also on the Eastern Front at Easter, you sometimes see soldiers reaching out to their opponents. But this is pretty unique in terms of the scale, in terms of soldiers actually meeting each other in no man's land, the exchange of gifts. This is something which is really confined to 1914. And as Chris has said, the high commands weren't keen on this. The British command may have seen it coming. They ordered trench raids earlier in December in order to try and get the British, keep the offensive spirit in the terms of the time up. But in 1915, 1916, looking back on 1914, the commanders senior commanders that is, make a big attempt to shell the enemy trenches, send out orders saying this must not happen, and threaten disciplinary action. So this is something that's in the scale of it and the fraternity of it, the closeness of it. This is something that's limited to 1914.
And I think a key point to make as well is that, you know, whilst these truces did happen in some areas, this is not in any way indicative of a kind of desire for pacifism among the troops.
No, absolutely not. If you read the letters from both sides, there's still a very strong sense, as Chris has said, that we have to fight this war and we can win this. But for Germans, British especially, Christmas is a special moment. It's a moment of peace and goodwill to mankind. It's a point at which they share certain cultures of Christmas so they can recognise each other's humanity in that. For the British regular army, which was still the main force in this part, Christmas was important as well as a time of norms being upturned. In peacetime, NCOs and non-commissioned officers would serve the men their Christmas dinner instead of having the normal hierarchy where men were being told what to do. So this was a bit of a magical time, where anything could happen.
Such an alien time.
Yeah.
I mean, it still happens in the Royal Navy. I mean, the captain and the officers always cook the Christmas lunch for the ship's company, even when you're at sea. So that still happens. I think Alex's point is well made about the cultural affinity between the Germans and the British. Not quite the same between the British and the French, despite the Entente Cordiale. And there's all sorts of images. Trees are big with the Germans, all that sort of thing really plays to this. But it is a one-off. And you can see in quite a lot of the journals of the war journals of the regiments, we're not doing that again. You know, we've seen it happen, but that's not happening next year.
The fact that it did happen, though, I mean, that one time, I mean, it's just worth pausing and just thinking, you've had this huge fighting. You know, the Germans have got 800,000 casualties, the British 90,000, much smaller army, of course. There's still everything to play for, to win in this in this war. And the fact that it did happen, despite all of that, despite the casualties, despite the fact that both sides thought they could win, despite the fact that both sides were prepared to go on for another 4 years, I mean, that is worth pausing and just thinking how amazing, how
And
miraculous.
it's only 4 months from the start of the war. So people can remember peace. They can remember last Christmas. As you transition into the bloodshed of 15, 16, people are getting used to the war being normality.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, you know, as to why it didn't happen in later years, you can kind of understand it. If it's 1916 and you've been through the Somme, say, you know, and you've been fighting the Germans for 2.5 years, you have a very different mindset to what you do in December 1914.
Sure, and the sacrifice has to be vindicated. This is the awful irony about war, that the more people die, the more a victory is needed. The more peace becomes difficult because those dead have to have some sense of meaning imbued into them, and only victory can do that.
Chris, is there anything even remotely like what we saw on the Western Front in Christmas 1914 throughout history? I mean, have we seen similar things where on special occasions sides have agreed for a couple of days to, you know, lay down their arms and almost come together?
If you go back to the ancient world, the Greeks thought it was sacrilege, for example, to fight during the Olympic Games.
Yes,
it was considered to be a holy time, and there were real sanctions in place for Greek city-states that violated that. And so right from the classical period, you've got that sort of sense. There are certain times you don't do it. I mean, if you go to the 11th and 12th century, the Catholic Church, the only church, imposes basically peace periods where it's called the Truce of God, where people don't fight against each other. It's trying to limit the internecine violence that is taking place mostly in what we now call France and the Low Countries and Burgundy. And all throughout, you sometimes get these periods where you say, right, stop now, have a think, but actually have a rest as well. So all throughout history, you've got that. In the early modern period, in the Civil War, you get similar situations around Christmas time, but more particularly Easter time in the 17th century. So you do have these occasions associated with holy days where it's not thought good to fight. You know, I think that's a prevailing image. When the First Crusade went through Constantinople in 1097, the Byzantines were appalled that the Franks, as they called them, were prepared to fight during Holy Week at Easter. And so this idea of a truce or a non-fighting period during significant events is actually quite prevalent throughout history. You know, peace and goodwill to all men.
It's a really good point. Well, listen, this has been absolutely fascinating, talking about the circumstances around the Christmas Truce of 1914. Let's ask ourselves a bigger question now, which is, what could have happened, could anything really have happened, to bring about peace by Christmas 1914? Chris, so you said earlier that you think it would have been a German victory, really, is the only viable circumstance by which the war ends in 1914. Do you want to just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, if the Schlieffen Plan had worked, if they put enough resources into it, if they'd swung down to the south of Paris as opposed to the north, as always with the Germans, they get really worried about being encircled. And so with the First and Second Armies north of Paris, they really thought with the French mobilising to the south, they could get cut off. So at that point, that's when they go back after the Battle of the Marne to actually prepared fortified positions inside France, but obviously occupying Belgium as well. At that point, the Germans could have said, well, OK, we've made the point. We can come back again if you misbehave, French. But as I say, I think when we consider what's going on elsewhere, the Germans are unlikely to do that. Why? And here I think is the critical thing. It's not happening on the Western Front. It's happened on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Tanberg has occurred. Now, the one thing the Germans really fear is this two-front war, which they've provoked. They wanted to knock out the French in 40 days so they can actually deal with the Russians.
But the Russians have mobilised much quicker than they expected.
But what has happened is that the Battle of Tanberg in August 1914, 2 Russian armies have been annihilated by the Germans. And I would say, and I don't know if Alex agrees with me, is that if the Germans hadn't achieved that victory in the East, they probably would have said, OK, we've made our point. What terms do you want in the West? Because actually the Russians are really mad at us now. And also, we might not have a two-front war. If we make peace now, we can turn on the Russians, deal with them, and see where we are. I think Tannenberg is the critical issue in the German mind, because if Tannenberg hadn't occurred, the Germans would be fighting on two fronts, and they'd be much more sort of willing to think, how can we stabilise the West?
Alex, do you agree with that?
Not wholly. Partly, I think Tanberg is important, but the Russians then... So Tanberg happens at the end of August 1914, so within a month of the war breaking out. But the Russians come back, that's the thing. They're kicked out, August, early September, they're kicked out of German territory, but then they come back in November. That's the thing, they come back in November. And the Germans managed to hold them, in part because, as we've talked about in that earlier episode on Ypres, it's very, very difficult to move long distances in this war, especially in 1914. So I think that the front would have stabilised in the east, maybe inside Germany, further inside Germany, further inside Germany's northeasterly province, East Prussia. But I think it probably would have stabilised. And I think in 1914, there's still a lot of Germans, particularly the German government, that is still very keen to fight this war through. And I think the fact that they've knocked out, they've captured so much of northeastern France, key industrial area, key agriculture area. They've got Belgium, which gives them access, broader access to the English Channel, to the sea. I think the Germans still reckon, most Germans, not all, that there's everything to win for. The exception, actually, is Falkenhayn, who in November, after this attempted push around Ypres, westwards to break through and get round the flank of the Entente armies, the French and the British armies. When that fails, Falkenhayn goes to the government and he says, we're not going to win this. You need to make peace, at least in the east. And that might be a plausible starting point for thinking about how 1914, how the war might have been over by Christmas 1914.
And the reason the Kaiser doesn't, is that just for political reasons?
It's not so much the Kaiser who makes that decision. It's his chancellor, a guy called Bethmann von Hollweg. And he doesn't because, firstly, he sees how strong the German armies are and what a strong position they are in on the Western Front. And secondly, at this point, how do you explain to the German public, look, we've conquered Belgium, we've conquered northeastern France, we've beaten the Russians at Tanberg, but now we want peace. You can't, there's no way that they can justify that in public terms, and that's the big problem.
There's another issue as well. Let's turn it round. Not one of these countries has achieved its war aim.
Yeah.
So Austria-Hungary hasn't sorted out Serbia, which was obviously the start of the conflict. The Germans haven't actually completed what's going on in France. The French don't have Alsace-Lorraine back, which they lost after the Franco-Prussian War. The Russians have designs on certain parts of Eastern Europe, particularly the German-occupied lands in East Prussia and what is now Poland.
And what is now Western Ukraine as well.
Absolutely, Western Ukraine. They don't have that buffer zone between them and the Germans, which they always seem to want. The Turks, for example, are saying, well, hang on, we've got an issue here. And the Italians sort of think they know what they want, but what they really want is the South Tyrol, which is south of the Alps, but still belongs to Austria, and so does Trieste. So everybody at the moment is saying, well, we came into this war, we made the sacrifices for these war aims, we still think we can win, and we need to get at least something, as Alex said, to justify the bloodshed so far. But the real issue is what I would say, how do you solve a problem like Germany? Because nobody's going to feel safe with Germany taking on Britain at sea and Germany able to mobilise in two directions. If they can do it now, they can do it again. So how do you chain Germany is the issue if you have a peace at this time? It's the same in Ukraine now. How do you stop Russia from doing what it wants to do?
The Ukraine comparison now is a really good one because, you know, a lot of people have talked about how trench warfare is basically back in Ukraine at the moment, and the casualty rate, much like it was by Christmas 1914, very, very high, and yet both sides would say, well, we haven't achieved our war aims.
And what was interesting, of course, the Russians thought it'd be over pretty soon, by Easter, having invaded in February.
Yeah.
So the old sort of heresies sort of remain in the military mind. I mean, I think, you know, for the war to be over, the Germans had to repeat the Franco-Prussian War, basically. And that's the end of it. And I think at that point, France obviously either comes to terms or is shattered. Britain's going to say, well, fine, we didn't want to be here anyway. When the Germans start their advance to the west, the Prime Minister, Hubert Asquith, writes to Venetia Stanley, his confidant or mistress, depending on what you think. He actually says, well, you know, we're just going to watch this going on. We're going to stay on the sidelines, see what happens. And then, of course, the whole pressure to get Britain involved in the war builds because Belgium's been invaded, and there's a specific threat across the Channel that Britain has never stood for about 100 years.
Well, is that not one of the other ways in which the war is over by 1914 if the British don't end up entering the war? Does that, I mean, presumably then Germany have a far better chance of winning the war by Christmas?
I don't know that the Germans have a better chance of winning the war by Christmas. They might have a better chance of beating the French, although even so, it's the idea that the Schlieffen Plan would have worked is doubtful. But even if it had, there'd still be major fighting going on in the east, where you've got to bear in mind the Russians have done very well against Austria-Hungary. I think the other issue, though, is that it's difficult to imagine the British not entering once the Germans take Belgium. For all the reasons that Chris has talked about, you know, the basic tenet of British foreign policy is to make sure no great power has the Belgian coast for the last few centuries. You see that back down to Tudor times. And then, of course, the other thing that the British haven't done in 1914 either is destroy the German fleet. And where are the British if the Germans manage to beat the French, and they would then presumably have a big advantage against the Russians too? The British are looking at a Germany which is straddling the continent, dominating the continent, doesn't need to spend so much on its army because it's knocked the major land forces, land opponents out, and it can build up its navy even more than it was doing before.
And remember at Jutland, 28 dreadnoughts on the British side, 16 on the German side.
Yeah.
And as Alex has pointed out, if they're occupying, and probably would occupy, the industrial coal-producing areas of northern France, their industry is going to churn out more dreadnoughts. And then you're going to get to parity as well. So Alex is right. The key issue about the German fleet, which would probably have to be restricted by treaty if we're going to stop the war at Christmas, but I don't think the Germans are going to put up with that. I think the critical issue in Christmas 1914 is that no one has achieved their war aim, the reason for actually getting involved in the conflict. And if you had one or two of those, you might stand a chance.
So let's just say, Alex, that the Schlieffen Plan does work. Big if, but let's just say. And as a result, the Germans have won on the Western Front by Christmas 1914. What are some of the long-term consequences that flow from that? I mean, presumably it strengthens their effort on the Eastern Front enormously.
It does. It's also an open question as to whether the British would have then removed themselves from the war or not, because with Belgium taken, with the fleet still in being, they could have continued. There's no reason for the British to drop the blockade, to try and stop putting pressure on Germany. So you may still have a world war going on, or at least a big European war going on both sides. But in the West, it's now naval. In the East, it's a land. But I think that you are looking at an ultimate German and Austro-Hungarian victory in the East too. The idea that Russia can continue without having the French fighting on the other side. I think the Germans, we're looking at German domination of the continent. We are looking at particularly big German gains in the West. So the Germans, by their September programme, War Aims programme of 1914, were talking about taking over Belgium, taking significant chunks of French territory. In the East, they're much vaguer. They just say, we want to push the Russians back as far as possible.
Yeah.
But exactly how that works, they haven't quite got their heads around yet. But certainly, we'd be looking at a German-dominated Belgium with German naval bases in Belgium from 1914, and I don't think that's a recipe for a lasting peace. I think we'd see.
So we would
war.
have we would probably have a Second World War at some point anyway, because
between the British and the Germans,
it would inevitably come to head.
I think it would do.
And your point actually very relevant, Chris, that if Germany controlled the industrial heartland of France, then they are going to be able to massively ramp up their naval production, and the naval arms race just continues apace.
Yeah, they actually say, you know, we took Alsace-Lorraine in 1871. Why don't we take this now? And yeah, it's a very valid point. It's interesting. I think what we have to bear in mind, as Alex says, about the idea of a world war, the Allies are busy seizing German colonies around the world at this point.
Yes.
And so there's an issue there related to that. I think the other issue I think we've got to bear in mind is that if you do get a peace in 1914, there are all sorts of things that don't happen. You delay the collapse of a lot of empires here.
Yeah.
The Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, maybe even the British Empire. So they linger on a lot longer. Do you have a Russian Revolution?
Well, that's a really interesting one, Alex. Let's bring you in on that. Does the Russian Revolution happen? And certainly does it happen the same way?
Not in if you've got peace in 1914, no, I don't think it does, especially if the Russians would negotiate, which I think they would do if the French were knocked out. I think you may have some things that we know today happening earlier in a different way, though. So one of the key centre point of the German War Aims plans is something called Mitteleuropa, Central Europe, a Central European Customs Union, which has been compared, not terribly fairly, but it's been compared to the European Union, the idea of a German-dominated economic bloc in the centre of Europe. And that certainly would have been the case from 1914 onwards, shutting the British out from international trade, from trade with Europe, or at least making it much more difficult to trade with Europe.
Just like now.
Well, to some extent, yeah. So I think that it's a mixed things. I think the Russian Romanov regime, the Tsarist regime, would have survived, but you would have some sort of economic European customs union dominated by the Germans from 1914 onwards.
We've discussed before on this programme. I think the Russian Revolution would have taken place much later, much more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. What I think is really interesting is if you look at the industrial output of the countries probably just before the war, Russia is becoming an industrial giant. So if Russia is given the space after 1914 to build up its industry and economy, you see all sorts of gradual changes taking place in the East. And Russia's ability both to conduct war, but also to assert its footprint. So I think the consequences here, if the war ends in 1914, the biggest one, actually, is that Russia becomes a monarchist superpower at some stage in the 1920s or 30s. And at that point, does Germany say, we need to attack them before they get too big?
Well, I mean, of course, that's exactly what the German High Command said in 1914, that we need to attack the Russians. This is the key reason why the Germans went into the war, that they were worried about that industrialization of Russia.
Yeah.
I think that if we think about the context in which the Russian revolutions, because of course there's one in 1905 as well, and then again in 1917 happened, clearly Russia was a very fragile state. It was changing, it was industrializing, that was creating new interest groups, and the political system of Russia wasn't catching up with that or meeting the demands of an industrial and growing middle class, albeit still small at this point. But these Russian revolutions happened in the context of war. They happened in the context of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and then they happened in the context of the First World War in 1917. Of course, they happened on the home front, and that's because there are big food shortages in the major industrial centres of Russia. So if the Russians end the war in 1914, even if they only get some sort of peace in which they negotiate a peace in which they don't do terribly well, there are ways of spinning this. And I don't think you're going to have the build-up of pressures that happens in wartime on the home front in Russia. So I think Chris is right. I think we can see the Russian monarchical state continuing into the 1920s and industrializing further. Maybe it evolves, maybe it doesn't. With Russia, it's always difficult to know.
I think there's a more prosaic point that comes out of this, is if you end the war in December 1914, what could those millions of people who got killed have done in terms of human progress? And war is a great innovator, so there's a number of things that happen in wartime. Tanks, aircraft,
Yeah.
all these other things.
First tank, 1916, Battle of the Somme.
Absolutely, at Flers-Courcelles, yeah. And so there's a big issue as to what you do in relation to the political settlement. We've mentioned already the empires would have survived, from the Russians in the east right through to the British Empire. So how does that affect what's going on? You certainly don't have a small corporal called Hitler rising in this situation. Stalin doesn't happen. So the whole focus of what goes on in Europe is changed if you end the war in 1914.
Well, the Soviet Union probably doesn't happen. I mean, you know, even though you say you still think probably a form of revolution takes place in Russia, be it 1917 or be it later,
I think
it wouldn't be a Bolshevik one.
No.
It wouldn't be what we ended up seeing. And so therefore you don't get the Cold War after the Second World War.
The whole ideologies of fascism and communism, I think, would have been squeezed out by monarchism and imperialism. That's the point. You actually set in aspect what has been happening before the war. But again, how do you solve a problem like Germany? That lies at the heart of the question for all these empires.
Well, Alex, on that, I mean, let's say you don't get the rise of Nazism, you don't get the rise of Adolf Hitler, but you probably do still get a second global conflict in the 20th century because of the domination of Germany and because of the inevitable conflict that would provoke with Russia, but also Britain. Does the Second World War become slightly less bloody? Does it become, I don't know, I mean, I don't know how to phrase it almost, but you don't have a madman sitting in his bunker in Berlin.
He's not mad. I would say Hitler is not mad, James. We always look at people, he is very rational indeed. He might not be reasonable, but he is rational. And he's only considered mad because he's not like you and me and Alex.
I mean, okay, yeah, but you take my point, Alex. You know, you get a very different type of German high command in the Second World War.
You do, and you don't get, I mean, the Imperial Germany, while there were certainly racism within Germany, the underlying core, or even overlying as well, core anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, this is very much, it's difficult to imagine that coming out of Imperial Germany. I mean, the First World War, it's actually the Russian Empire that is the most anti-Semitic power and perpetrates pogroms on the Eastern Front. So I think you are looking at something very different. Of course, we talk about Germany being a problem, but for the Germans, Russia is a problem. As Chris has said, Russia is industrializing. So a key reason why the war didn't end in 1914 is because, and Chris has said this, but just to make it absolutely crystal clear, the problems that statesmen see in the summer of 1914 and the reasons why they go to war haven't been solved through this war. And any peace is only going to be temporary. For the Germans, the Russians are still very strong, very powerful, and getting stronger. They haven't been knocked out. And the Germans are still surrounded. For the Austro-Hungarians, Serbia hasn't been resolved, and Russia is still looming over them. For the British, they've still got this problem with the German fleet challenging them for global supremacy, and now Germany is in Belgium. And the Germans aren't easily going to retreat from that territory. If we look at the war plans of 1914, the Germans have clear plans about what they want to do in the West from September 1914. They've got this idea of a Central European customs union. They don't necessarily really want to take territory in the East, though. They just want to weaken Russia. But if they come out with that and they don't retreat at all or very much in the West, then France and Britain are worse off than they are before, while Germany still has Russia as a big threat over them. So, yeah, I think we're looking at, if there is peace in 1914, we're looking at a repeat.
Well, there's another thing. We haven't mentioned the United States.
Well, of course, they wouldn't have entered the First World War, and then what follows from that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've discussed in other programs that probably the Americans turned to the Pacific. They're already expanding into the Philippines and that sort of thing. They're going to come up against Japan, which is also expanding its influence in the East Asia area. So are we going to see basically a Europe at peace, a contested peace maybe, and the United States actually fulfilling its manifest destiny across the Pacific? And you don't have the shape of the world that you have as a result of intervention by America.
Yeah, and also, presumably, if the Americans haven't intervened in the First World War, by the time a Second World War comes about in Europe, they are far less likely to intervene then. And as a result, that makes a German victory more likely in a second European war.
I think that's true. And I suppose you've also got differences within Europe and the empires that particularly France and Britain have. Because if we think about, and for that matter, Russia is an empire too. There's no independent Poland if the war ends in 1914. The boundaries of Eastern Europe look very, very, very different, radically different from how they are today. But you've also got the reason why these changes happened at the end of the First World War is because you've got this idea coming out of the Russian Revolution, coming out of the US entry of what's called national self-determination. The idea that peoples should run themselves, the Poles should run themselves, the Czechs should run themselves. But of course, that idea captures imaginations right across the world and contributes towards the pushback against the British in India, pushback against the French in Africa. And the First World War sees these huge global empires wobbling because of this idea of the national self-determination that comes out of it. And if that doesn't happen, Britain remains a major global power bloc. France as well, most probably. Germany would have likely increased its colonial holdings too. So the US doesn't become the dominant superpower. Russia, as the Soviet Union, doesn't become the superpower. You end up with a much more multipolar world in the 1920s, 30s and 40s.
I think the other aspect is, I think that if you'd had a second conflict afterwards, Britain would have said, we're not interested in this.
Really?
We have a global footprint. We didn't much like that 4 months we had in 1914.
As long as we can protect our empire.
Yeah, as long as the empire's safe, we dominate the seas, why on earth should we bother? So in fact, British isolationism is actually a possibility after this point. And they say, OK, if the French and the Germans want to have another go at each other, didn't affect us during the Franco-Prussian War, you keep Belgium clear and we'll stay out of it.
But is that realistic, though? Because would the British not always think, well, I'm sorry, if the Germans are dominating continental Europe, that inevitably is going to strengthen their naval capacity, and as a result then, Britain's naval supremacy may come under threat?
Germany's going to do what it can do, but as you can see, we can still blockade Germany quite happily. Unless they can break out, there's a real problem. I think the real issue in 1914 is that the Britons have gone, oh yeah, submarines, they're a bit of a problem. So British anti-submarine warfare probably would have actually got a lot better. And I think warfare in general, because of what people have seen, would have taken another leap forward in terms of capability. Because people will say, we've seen what industrial warfare does. It changes how we think about warfare and what we have to do to counter some of these threats.
Just thinking, Alex, in terms of some of the legacies of what followed the First World War as it really played out, and of course the redrawing of boundaries, including, of course, in the Middle East. I mean, dare we even talk about what the Middle East might look like today had the war been over by 1914?
Sure, well,
Ottomans survived.
The Ottomans survived, that's right. The Ottomans, you know, the Middle East would be dominated by the Ottoman Empire still, absolutely.
And indeed, what's interesting is that Turkish foreign policy now in the Middle East talks about Ottomanization.
Yeah.
They want to have the influence they had at the time of the Ottoman Empire. And so, you know, that's the key issue there, is the Ottomans actually survive. and also what's really important is the Germans are really in bed with the Ottomans. So you're going to see a lot of German influence in the Ottoman Empire at that point.
It's tricky to know, isn't it? I mean, I suppose in the end it could go two ways, because on one hand, if the war ends in 1914, you've had all of those casualties, you've had an inability on all sides to get the quick victory that they hoped for. And you've got a shared monarchical ideology across most of Europe. You know, Britain is a monarchy, Germany is a monarchy, Austria-Hungary is a monarchy, Russia is a monarchy. So there are ideas that are sticking Europe together and that could survive through 1914.
You could have another concert of Europe.
You could have another concert of Europe, exactly.
War, yeah.
The flip side of that is, as we've talked about, that the reasons the war broke out, the First World War broke out for reasons of insecurity, reasons of mutual fear, And none of this is solved by 1914. So there's always that opportunity and that option of it rearing itself up, and this simply not being a peace, but merely a frozen conflict.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is if you leave Germany in power as it is in Christmas 1914, it's like leaving Napoleon in power in 1815 and saying we're hoping for the best. And the strategy of wishful thinking never works.
And Chris, you said something really interesting earlier about, you wouldn't necessarily get the rise of the big ideologies of fascism and communism. Alex, what is your take on that? Because, Karl Marx has long since written Das Kapital by this point. So there is an argument that actually these ideas would still find a way of spreading.
So, Das Kapital is famous at this point. It has spread. It's inspired many people, both socialist and those who would name themselves communist or Bolshevik. But it needs a takeover of a big power, Russia, in order to get the global impact that it does, that is, that communism does through the 20th century. So, for sure, communism as an idea would have existed. It did already, as you've said, but it wouldn't have had the influence it is. And fascism itself, that comes directly out of the experience of total mobilization in the First World War.
I think fascism and communism are like boxes of matches. Until you actually have the conditions to ignite something, they're never going to be used.
So as a result, would China today be run by the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, people would dispute whether it's a proper communist regime or not now, but would communist China, would Red China have happened?
Well, it depends on all sorts of issues. I mean, if you don't have a Second World War, you don't get the Chinese Communist Party in power. I think China's always going to fall apart, whatever happens. It was coming to the end of a very long decadent dynasty, and I think with imperial powers in Europe still strong, very imperialist, I think they'd have taken more chunks out of China as well. And that's what Japan tries to do, of course, with Manchuria.
Yeah. Alex, final thought from you. If the war had finished in the Western Front by 1914, by Christmas 1914, which is a big if, and we've explored why that realistically would have been very unlikely, but let's say that happened. Just sum up what from your perspective, would have been the biggest consequences?
Whatever would have happened if the war had ended in 1914, whether it had been a frozen peace, whether it had been a permanent peace, whether it had resulted in another Second World War, a global war, it's difficult to imagine anything worse than what we actually got. And in that sense, going back to the Christmas Truce, I think Christmas 1914, the Truce of 1914, while it doesn't represent any hope of any real peace through Europe or any changing of the 20th century, this is localized, this is about exhausted soldiers just taking that moment to pause the fighting before then continuing it. I think the Christmas Truce is still special as a moment of shared humanity before the real horror of the 20th century begins.
That's a lovely note to end on. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Professor Alexander Watson and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like and subscribe to History Undone on YouTube. And you can also listen, follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.